The wild rose has forever been one indicator of the time that you can get summer bark. Bark is broken down into a winter bark and a summer bark. And the wild rose thing is a good indicator for summer bark. For winter bark, it's either, well before the wild roses bloom or well after they're done blooming. And the reason that they want winter bark, you get a totally different color and texture to the inner side of the bark. And for folks that particularly do what I call sheet baskets that are made out of one sheet of bark, and they'll take a sheet of winter bark or smaller pieces of winter bark, and if you wet the winter bark down, it turns a deep brown, and then they can etch, either remove that or etch into it to make the pattern. It's a winter bark basket, and what distinguishes it, when this basket was first made with this piece of bark, it was all this deep brown color. And that comes from the time of year when the bark was harvested, which was probably late May, could be early June. And then the basket maker just determines what kind of patterns and stuff he wants to do, or she wants to do, and they etch, either leave the brown in or etch the pattern. So this is kind of a neat basket in that he did one thing on this side where he etched away all of the winter bark except the pattern, and on this side he just etched away the pattern but left most of the bark. He did the same thing for this beaver, which is just etched in here it's just left to go. This basket is interesting for other reasons. Normally they use willow root or something like that, but this basket was sewn together and the lid was cedar bark, which is a really nice bark and adds a lot of neat design to the basket itself. So that's winter bark, and you can also get winter bark in the fall. When it comes to harvesting bark, you can harvest bark from all different size trees. The thickness and the quality of the bark largely depends on the size of the tree, but not necessarily. Sometimes you find really large trees with very thin bark, and right next to it a small tree with very thick bark. So I'm not sure what's going on there. It's probably a genetics thing. But we can look here at these two smaller trees. I harvested some bark from them a few years ago. Just let them go. And to give you an example, they're both still apparently healthy, vigorous. And so the thing that you try to do when you harvest bark to minimize the damage is cut into this outer layer of bark as shallow as possible, and yet still be able to get the bark off. And so this was taken, and you can, if you looked over here, you can see where the inner bark was damaged a little bit during the process. So probably went a little bit too deep, but it didn't seem to affect the tree. The tree has a process called compartmentalization, where they're able to actually seal off these damaged and wounded places. It's a very neat process. So what I usually do, if I want the tree to be damaged as little as possible, is I start, with a fairly shallow cut, like so, and that was just deep enough for this. So you can see I'm kind of slipping the bark off here. And taking the outer bark off around the tree, like so. And you have spots where, and you can see this is where I nicked the inner bark, but it hasn't gone all the way through the inner bark. And I think there's, based on what was going on with this tree, I don't think there's a problem in the future. One of the things that's kind of interesting about these smaller trees is I think it's because the bark is thin and somehow or another some light is able to get through, and you actually still have chlorophyll. That's this green color here. As the tree ages and the bark gets thicker, you don't see this green color. From what I've read in some of the Scandinavian experience, they say that you can harvest bark from the same tree 3 times in the tree's life. So what does that mean? That means that this layer here, I don't remember when I took that off the tree. It was probably, 5 or 6 years ago anyway. And I took this one off today. And so possibly we can try, see if this is thick enough to remove now. So the same deal, you just kind of cut down through. There it comes. Right there. So this is kind of take it off as easy as you can. So you end up with this piece of bark that grew back after the original bark was taken off. So ultimately this piece here should do the same thing. Whenever we get into discussions about birch bark, there's always the thing, well, does it kill the tree? And I think there's absolutely no question but what you can kill the tree taking the bark off. Anybody tells you different, they're lying to you, as far as I'm concerned. But there are ways of getting. So what are the things that would affect whether or not the tree lives or dies? So there's a couple things. One is just look at the general health of the tree. If it doesn't have many branches on it, or it looks kind of sickly in the crown, first of all, you may not be able to get any bark off that tree because it's not growing enough to make new bark. But if you were able to get bark off that tree, the tree just may die because it doesn't have the vigor. Another thing is how much bark you take off the tree. You can see, this is interesting here. This is the very original bark on this tree. This was the bark that grew when the tree was an inch or two smaller than it is now. And as the tree develops, the bark stretches, and eventually it kind of splits and tears off. So you can see that all up and down this tree here. Anyway, but the other thing is how much bark you take off a tree. And if the tree is going to be logged, cut down in the next few months or a year, it really doesn't make much difference how much bark you take off, because the tree's going to be cut and down anyway. But if you want the tree to live, I don't have a good rule of thumb, but my feeling is you don't take more than 3 or 4 feet off the tree, and if the tree is healthy and vigorous, it'll be able to grow a new layer of bark and live for numerous more years. I've seen trees that had the bark taken off, I don't know how long ago, but you could hardly, but but you could hardly tell where the bark, you could just barely see differences between what people call the first growth of bark and the second growth of bark. So ultimately this would change even more than it is, and it never looks like this again, but it does take on more of a natural whitish birch bark color. And so how do you tell the quality of the bark? Well, one way is by cutting a small patch out, and then you can take that patch. Canoe makers in particular are really interested in this whole idea. They try to figure out, well, how flexible is the bark? You know, does it come apart easily in layers, or does it stay pretty much a solid piece of bark? This piece of bark here, it peeled off just easily, this layer, so chances are that wouldn't be canoe bark. And, you know, you can go on down and you can take the next layer off and probably I don't know if I can get this way. I can get part of it anyway. See, what I'm doing when I split this, more or less, is I'm just like in the wood, bark is formed every year, and there's an annual ring. And it's in birch in particular that annual feature shows up, and so that when you're trying to get this bark off, what you are more or less doing is splitting it along the part between the two annual rings that are affected here. So you can just kind of slowly keep working it, like so. And so you end up, and so this, you know, this is the way you can come to, you know, to make this bark more or less usable for a particular thing. And these different layers of bark have different properties. This is the innermost layer. So this was probably produced this year, like so. And then this is probably last year's layer. Although there could be another layer of bark here that I just can't separate. And so you end up, you know, with these layers of bark that have different properties and different quality. And so this one here, you know, they'll bend it like this, and these are the lenticels, these dark horizontal lines here. Those are, their primary function is for gas exchange between the inside, inner part of the tree and the outside. So you've got CO2 coming out, you've got oxygen being taken in. I don't know what the rates of these things are, but that's how these, some people call them eyes, function. And you know, you can look at trees standing side by side and you'll see how much different the lenticel layers are from one tree to the next. There's a good example of those are much bigger lenticels on that tree, but we can maybe see that later. So anyway, that's a feature that's good, and then all these layers that it does not break into. Again, you know, the idea is, how do you get this bark off, you know, without damaging the tree? And as we did in that little tree, you know, you can just, I mean, if the tree's going to die, cut down a year or two, you don't worry about it. But if you want it to live, you just kind of slowly start cutting into it. Sometimes it'll just pop right out, open. You can hear it. It'll just, the tree, it's under such tension because the wood grows faster than the bark does. I think we're pretty much close to it there now. I think I can get this piece off. Kind of slip your tool in underneath. And just take it off. Like so. And we stood here long enough, but you can see right, I didn't get in very far, so it didn't cut into it, but oftentimes when you remove the bark, it must release some of the tension in that tree, and you'll get these little cracks in the inner bark. I would suspect if we came back tomorrow or the next day, you'd have a number of those just small slits. I don't think they maybe go all the way through. They might. But anyway, so you got this off. And as we saw in that younger tree, now this is a really good example of the lenticels and how they change, you know, as you go into the tree. You can just barely see them here, but they get more predominant, and they're filled with, I guess, a very porous sort of material that allows for this gas exchange to occur. And here you can see some other features that this is obvious here. This is a branch scar. At one point there was a branch growing there. It died off and the tree heals that over. This is interesting here. This is I knew but I don't remember now. This is an insect. There's an insect that burrows in under the bark. It doesn't go any deeper than the inner bark, but it kind of makes these little tracks around in here. So that's what that is. And you know, lenticels will be bigger or smaller. I don't see anything else. But this is what's inside of this piece right here. You'd probably have that same sort of an eye there. So again, this, you know, I think this is definitely, to me, safe that this tree is not going to be affected. You know, the possibility would be, you know, that you go up there another 2 feet and you could take that off, and you know, there's no sign of you know, dead branches or anything in the crown of this tree, so I'd say there's a really good chance that this tree would no question you've affected the tree. You know, you can't argue that. You've taken this layer off, which is an important protective layer, and the tree, by its physiology, is probably started right now to mobilize some chemicals or cell divisions inside this tree that will tend to seal this part off from the rest of the tree. But, well, that's not right true. Because what's going to happen here is, with, as you saw in that young tree, the same thing is going to happen to this tree. But by the end of this year, this will all probably be deep brown or black. Next year or two, you'll start to see these little polygons, pieces start to form and start to be shed. And then underneath this whole thing, the cambial layer is living, and so it starts to make new bark, as we saw here when I took this off. So this is the bark that's being formed, you know, underneath after the death, basically the death and the shedding, partial shedding of this layer here. It's a really interesting process. You know, and how trees protect themselves. You know, we sort of think, oh, they're just standing there, you know, they're not doing anything, but there's all kinds of stuff going on inside this tree. The water's going up, the sugars are coming down, you know, there are various chemicals, defensive and otherwise, that are being produced to, you know, help this tree fend off any organisms, including humans that come by and steal its bark. But it's just a hugely interesting process in the whole thing. Here is part of what they call the sugar hills. I think it's a moraine. historically it was all glaciated, and the dominant trees on this old forest, trees in here are probably over 100 years old, are maple and basswood, and then you've got paper birch scattered throughout. And this is where paper birch grows best, at least to my way of thinking. But so you find some areas on lesser productive soils where you got pure birch, and the birch is okay, but it doesn't get as big. So canoe makers and all, I think they like this sort of land because it's a chance of finding trees that are big, and that you can, use bark from one tree to make most of the canoe, and then you have to add some others too. But this is probably, to me, the most magnificent trees on this area are these birch or basswood clumps. There's one of them right over there. 3 trees, and it's just these trees in here. I'm sure some of them are well over 100 feet tall, and it's not real common in Minnesota to find. If you look, you can just see. You probably take a picture around the tree, because the bark varies a lot around the tree. It's really rough on this side, and much smoother right here. And then as you go up the tree, the bark tends to smooth out. So I thought what we could do would be to try to get a little piece off down here. So you just make a vertical cut in the bark, and then sometimes it just pops right off. But here, just nudge it a little bit. And you just kind of, in this case, kind of help it with your fingers. You can see this really rough stuff here. On this tree, it translates into this sort of surface, this kind of pimply bark. And, for most people, this probably is not the kind of bark that you want to use for everything. But for some folks, they could use this bark. I'll take it off all the way around here. That's not bad. So anyway, that's what this looks like. So let me go get the ladder, and we can go up the tree and see if it looks any different. I have had the ladder slip out from under me, and I've had to slide down the tree. It's all fun. So, this is a big old tree, older than what I usually get bark off of, but you can see this rough area here. Not exactly sure how that all happens, but and then you've got a much smoother part of the bark over here. You don't have this rough surface. You got this smoother surface, and then I think if you look at this here, it's kind of something in here that's a little bit different. So this, for weaving and a lot of basket making, you don't use this part of the bark. This is the outermost layer. This goes off like so. So think about that piece. Think about this rough side. Think about this smooth side. We'll turn it over. So this is the rough side. You see this piece that we had earlier here that was really rough and low on the tree. It was really pimply. This piece is you know, a little pimply, but not as much. And you still have this, but this would be usable bark here. And then that one blemish, see this here area, kind of a split in the bark. There was another piece over here. You see how this nice smooth area, there's a little bit of the rough stuff here, but pretty smooth here. And that translates into a much smoother surface. So for my uses, especially this part of the bark is the best part of this piece of bark. And it could be used otherwise. And anyways, this will have a number of nice pieces for weaving. You can peel this rough stuff off. Like so, it takes some work, and you might have to use a knife or something too. You know, sometimes you get stuff that comes off real easy. Sometimes you got to work at it. But here, kind of work it with your hands. So we're getting all that white, the outermost layer off. Just kind of bring it around. You know, I usually do this after we get back home. But, you know, if you're carrying bark out a long way, sometimes it's good to get rid of as much of the stuff as you're not going to use. To get this out of the woods, you know, if you got a long haul, sometimes what you want to do is, this piece might not roll very good, but you roll it, you can roll it up. So you roll it, this is up and down the tree this way, you roll the bark as if it were up or down the tree. This might be kind of hard to roll. Anyway, yeah, you just roll it up like this. And take a piece of rope and tie it on it. And then you can store it like this for a while. Or what I prefer to do is once I get it home, I unroll it and then I put it under some heavy, I use pallets, under pallets like this to keep it from, what it wants to do, it wants to roll backwards like it came off the tree, it wants to curl back like this. And you want to prevent that from happening as much as possible. So anyway, that's a pretty piece of bark. Some, you know, there's some folks would, you know, be able to take advantage of these kind of patterns, this rough pattern here. I can't do that for weaving, but it certainly is possible. This part of the tree is called the outer bark. And there's a growth layer right between this outer bark and inner bark that makes the outer bark. So we're just probably getting to the end of that season right now. And so this is the inner bark, and what's going to happen here, I've tried to be as careful as I can not to cut too deeply all the way to the wood here. This is going to turn black eventually, and it'll start to slough off. And it'll slough off in kind of different shapes. And but usually there's not much talk about using the inner bark. The inner bark is actually, if you can get this off here, Let me go get a different, maybe this knife will work this way. The inner bark structure is totally different than the outer bark. And I've recently learned of a recipe that somebody came up with to make cookies using the inner bark and other normal ingredients. And so this is the layer that they use, and they actually make a flour out of it. I've never done it, but I want to take some home. So this is the inner bark. Here's the tree. Here's the wood right here. So all of this layer is the product of what's called the cambium. The cambium is just a thin layer of a few cells, and through its division during the growing season, it makes wood to the inside. That's what makes your annual rings. When you look at a tree, how you can age a tree, the cambium, the growth resulting from the cambium is that. It also produces the phloem, which is this really moist layer here, which is also living, and so the wood transports water from the roots to the top. This layer, the phloem, transports the sugars and other materials manufactured in the leaves. It transports that material through this phloem layer to the other living parts of the tree so that it has the energy to grow and whatever it needs that for. So anyway, so that's taking the tree apart down to the wood. What happens here now, according to what I've read, is that the tree is able to do some what they call compartmentalization, and it can sort of seal off this layer here, and the cambium would start to grow, and over a long period of time the tree could live and it could regrow over this area. It would be a long process, but what I wanted to do was get a few pieces of this so I can go home and, they say, just to make a flour out of this by buzzing it up in a blender or something, and then just using it like flour along with flour and sugar and butter and stuff like that. Anyway, so that's kind of the structure of the tree as well. So this tree right here is on Blandon property, Blandon Timber Company or Blandon Paper Mill, and I've been allowed to harvest bark off of this tree because this land is going to be logged probably within the next 3 or 4 months. And so, although what I'm doing to this tree right now is very damaging, if you wanted it to continue to live and be healthy, it's not much longer for this world. So every year I call up them, I call up the county, I call up other folks that have land, or they, find out about me, and I just ask them if they, there's any chance of getting bark someplace, and like the county, they have a regular timber sale program, so they know what timber sales have birch bark on them, and the same with Blandon on this piece. They knew, oh yeah, we got this piece of land that's got some bark on it. And so, and same with the Forest Service. What I showed you was taking a sheet of bark off a tree. I don't do this very often, but I've done it and I've seen others do it. If you want really long pieces of bark, by taking a sheet off, you're limited to the diameter of the tree. But just at the right time of year, you can get bark off in big long strips. So you start this here, and it'll just come off around the tree like this. But I think we can keep going here a little bit, maybe. Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. You can see here just by pulling this through. I'm getting a strip of bark off. And it's got to be just the right time of year, which is right now, to get these bark strips off the tree. Let's see. Just keep going around. And you want to do it in a very, very shallow angled spiral so that the bark is more or less coming off in its horizontal design. The steeper you make it, the less useful it is, just because of the way these lenticels. This is a good example here of what these lenticels look like. They actually are pores that have some material in them, but they allow gaseous exchange through the bark of the tree. We'll go all the way around with this just to show you. Yeah, I had a tree the other day that I had started. What did I do? Yeah, I cut it way up the tree, and I was coming down, and the bark started all on its own to unravel. And I got about a 40-foot piece off the tree with almost doing no work at all. I just sort of helped the tree along. Actually, it was started this way. I was really amazed. But this has come off really good too. You can see it's loose enough that you don't have to do much other than just make your cut. Like so. Okay, that's good. So, what you end up with, instead of, being limited to a piece of bark this long, you can get a piece, that you can cut into others. So this is probably, 10, 12 feet long, something like that. And you can do this all the way up the tree. And then what you do then is just kind of roll it up in a ball, like so. And you've got, they usually will wrap it all the way around and have a big ball, from what I've seen people do. Anyway, so those are two different ways of getting bark off the tree, depending on just what it is you're after. As the tree loses vigor, my interpretation anyway is it grows less and it doesn't let go of its bark as readily as a vigorous, healthy tree. And then once it dies, then that bark layer, you don't have the cambium working anymore, so that bark layer is kind of stuck to the wood, or to the inner bark. And what needs to then happen is the bacteria, insects, and that sort of thing, they start to work on that wood layer and the inner part of the bark. and then it'll start to come off almost as good as off a living tree. But this is going to have some really good bark in it. Maybe now if I get up there higher. Well, that's perfect, being able to tear that outer bark, that white layer off. Really to deal with the whole bark layer. So, you know, I think part of that roughness area, you know, is there may have been branches and stuff on there that now that's a nice piece of bark. So there, you know, there's a couple ways of getting the bark out of the woods. One way is to roll it into bundles like this. You can put 2, 3, 4 pieces together. But the way you roll it, what you don't want it to do, the bark was on the tree this way. This is up or down. And you don't, at least for an extended length of time, you don't want to give it a chance to fold. There's the natural way it wants to fold is back in on itself or back out on itself. And it can be really difficult to get that flat again. So what you want to do is roll it as though you'd be rolling it up the tree or down the tree. And you normally roll it with the inside layer out, and you just roll up like this. And you can, you know, roll 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces together. And one thing showed up here that's worth mentioning. This, we were talking about lenticels before. The lenticels here are pretty big, and I noticed you can see some places here where the lenticels are pretty big that they're starting to split when you roll it. So you want to be careful when you roll it and not roll it really tight, but just kind of in, you know, fairly loose. Like this. And wrap it up with something. There's actually basswood in the bark here. It's a nice material. So I probably want to put 2 or 3 pieces around, but you can see here the splits where that's kind of splitting along the lenticel there, and that's a concern. But for weaving, it's not too much problem. For sheet baskets and stuff like that, those things are not good. So, in the other way, you know, when I come out of the woods, I usually have my bark stacked in, and I like to have it flat, so I usually have some weight over it. Just try to keep it as flat as I can. It's a beautiful piece of bark. There's some blemishes here and there, but that's a nice piece of bark. Makes you drool. And then if I can, when I'm in the woods, I'll tear off all that white bark because I don't need it, and it helps to flatten, keep this piece of bark flat. And so when I'll get this back home, and I'll stack it up in a pile with pallets, maybe 5 or 10 pieces per layer, and stack it up 4, 5, 6 feet, and then cover it up and let it store for. Now it's best to use it right after you get it off the tree if you can, but usually, at least I can't. And so you cover it up, keep the sun off of it, keep it cool, and it'll stay weavable for, well, I've had it stay weavable. It changes, but I've had it stay weavable for at least 5 or 6 years. And some doesn't stay that long, but this, you know, I got this about 2 days ago, and if I had the time, the thing to do, like my friend and my mentor says, the best time to weave a basket is right under the tree that you took it from. Let's look at this. So, for making this so-called birch bark flour, I learned about it from a friend of mine, and then I found a Google presentation that was really good, and I got all excited about it. And so the last 2 or 3 days I've been stripping bark off of these birch trees and put it in the oven, drying it, and then putting it in a grinder. I use a coffee mill and making it into a fairly fine powder. Not as fine as you know, wheat flour or something like that, but I can show that to you later. But anyway, so this was the size of the tree. Actually, this was the size of the tree. And so this is just one of the branches. So the first thing you do is you take off the outer bark layer. This is what was on the tree here, like so. You take that off, and you get it down here. Again, we were looking up that other thing. You get down to, you get that outer bark layer off, and you've got this green layer of inner bark, like so. And then you get all that off. Like so. Then you get down to this inner bark layer, this green layer, and then you peel that off. Then, you know, in a larger tree, you could get a bark layer that's 3/8, ½ inch thick. I can show you some of that inside. And then you just peel all this stuff off, put it in the oven to dry, let it dry. The recommendation I had in the stuff I was reading was about temperature was 250 for 15 hours. No, 30 hours. 250 for 30 hours. So you get that all dried up, and then let me go get my jar of flour. About the thickness of this layer here, I mean it's really thin up here. You know, it's a little bit thicker down below, but it's you know, at this point it's not even a 1/16 of an inch. Over here, this was probably maybe a 1/16. You get up further on an older tree, and you get, this is about almost a half inch, 3/8 to a half inch here. So this, you know, you can use this, or I guess you can use this other stuff. I used this for a while, and then I thought, well, why don't I use the bark from a smaller tree? And it's sure a lot easier to do. So you dry that, and then you put it in the oven for a while, and then I just use a coffee grinder, and I put these little chips like this in it, and I grind it up, and this is birch bark flour, inner bark flour. So it doesn't have any of the outer bark, just the inner bark. And I have heard, and this thing that I use for my reference, if you ever wanted to read more about it, this really nice article about the whole thing. A woman out in Vermont, and she talks about the fact that there is historical record of people using birch inner bark flour, and sometimes it was just sort of a starvation food, or to stave off starvation. They'd run low on food in the spring, and they'd do that. Or some even say that it was used, you know, to make edible food, I guess you'd say. So anyway, it's just really, really thin. I think it's a little bit thinner or thicker, particle-wise, than white sugar is, or white flour is. So that's about it. Then you got a cookie.
It's really good.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I thought I might go get part of some more bark today, so I have a little bit more. I got enough in here to make, according to the recipe, I got enough in here to make 14 batches of cookies.
So do you use regular flour with it, or do you use that?
The recipe is, I remember, 3/4 cups of regular flour. They recommend white flour, but I suppose you could use anything. 1/4 cup of this stuff. 1/4 cup of sugar. A 1/2 cup of butter, softened butter, and then just a pinch of salt. And then you just kind of, you know, knead all that together into a big ball and roll it out, just like, you know, cut it into whatever shapes you want. Put it in the oven at 350 for, I can't remember, 15 minutes, 15 or 20 minutes, and you got it. But I think it's really a cool thing. I really got into it. I spent the last 48 hours, just about all my time, making that stuff. Just one other thing that we get from the forest that we